Holy shit, a BioShock game without tacked-on multiplayer? Okay, so first of all, I'd like to apologize for the lateness of this review, but I've noticed something quite extraordinary in the time between when my written review was published and now. BioShock Infinite is fast becoming one of the highest rated games of the generation, and nearly every critic seems to cite the game's story, particularly the ending, as a chief reason for this. Well, what is PCGmedia if not brutally honest? So if you're too lazy to read my written review, or if you just love the sound of my uncomfortably nondescript accent, here's a video about why BioShock Infinite isn't game of the gen material. Don't get me wrong, I actually loved BioShock Infinite, and there are definitely a lot of aspects that Irrational Games executed extremely well. But what is it that makes BioShock stand out? Is it the gameplay? No, BioShock is basically Left 4 Dead. Take out the co-op, stick in some superpowers, and there you go, done. Enemy AI would definitely be exempt from corporal punishment in America. Human enemies never bother to take cover and run directly into kill zones like fish in a barrel. Difficulty consists of being outnumbered and fighting bullet sponges that get in your face and prevent you from performing certain actions. It can be fun with the right mindset, but gunplay is simple and shallow. Granted, the powers do open up a lot more gameplay latitude than blindly spraying bullets across a horde of zombies. When Justice plays BioShock Infinite, he doesn't use powers, like, at all. Whereas I always try to find ways to disable or distract enemies before I do any shooting. I have to give the game credit for that, but even then, there isn't as much latitude as, say, last year's Dishonored, which used an almost identical dual-wielding system. The game also has a way of adding more verticality to the genre in the form of skylines. This contextual combat tool definitely feels cool, and is a lot more controllable than you'd expect, but the exhilaration mainly comes from the excellent sound design and set pieces that accompany them. At the end of the day, they don't offer as much three-dimensional freedom as, say, a jetpack. The other gameplay gimmick comes in the form of tears. Unfortunately, tears feel incredibly tacked on. Seeing that staticky visual cue as soon as you enter a room really telegraphs the fact that a gunfight is coming. Most of the time, it just gets in the way and doesn't offer anything helpful. People love to talk about how Elizabeth's AI is awesome, but it's not. She gives you health when you need health, mana when you need mana, ammo when you need ammo. That's the extent of it. It's not rocket science. But if Left 4 Dead with superpowers sounds cool to you, then no worries. You know, as I said, I really enjoyed BioShock, but the slogan, "From the makers of the highest rated first-person shooter of all time," is more than a little misleading. Like I said in my written review, BioShock isn't a shooter. It's a conduit for telling an interactive story. So how is the story? Well, if you're a sucker for character development, guess what? I honestly can't think of any other first-person shooter with better character development. BioShock avoids cliches while still managing to make each character's motivation clear and relatable, even when shrouded in mystery. The story never relies on coincidence or serendipity to progress the plot, unless it's at the expense of the protagonist, and moments where the story takes a turn for the worse affect how you play. It might sound like I'm just ticking boxes, but I really appreciate a game that gets all of these things right. If I were to label BioShock Infinite as a narrative genre, it would be sci-fi mystery, with an emphasis on the mystery. Moments of intrigue range from the incredibly subtle to bombastic and brazen. But not one clue gives enough information to complete the puzzle before the game's end. If you got it, you guessed. Each story beat is introduced with masterful pacing, but sometimes this can be a detriment to gameplay. The story is exactly as long as it needed to be, and each revelation along the way has a lot of room to breathe before the next idea is introduced. However, this means most of BioShock is actually filler. You'll find yourself doing things twice or visiting places you've already been for no reason. In the original BioShock, the open-world Metroidvania nature of Rapture made this a little more bearable. BioShock Infinite is a different kind of story, however. It's character-driven and it has a constant feel of urgency and linearity. Since backtracking is useless, it no longer feels like freedom, but rather padding. Speaking of the original BioShock, two things that made the game stand out and endure as a cult classic are almost universally recognized as the game's opening and ending revelation. As far as Infinite's opening is concerned, you won't be disappointed. In fact, I'd argue that Infinite has a stronger opening than the original. Every step you take, every sight you see in the first hour of Infinite's campaign was meticulously designed to tell the story without taking away freedom of movement, except for that part where Brooker was actually restrained. The introduction is a masterpiece of level design, sound design, and environment art, culminating in superb pacing and one of the best first impressions a first-person game has ever delivered. The ending, I'm afraid, is a different story. Please don't get me wrong. The ending is not a cop-out or a deus ex machina. It's not a cliche, and it makes perfect sense, effectively tying up all of the loose ends. If you've heard the story about how one of the guys at Irrational wrote a resignation letter after finishing the game, yes, there is a reason for that. The story is as provocative as it is enigmatic. Unfortunately, my problem with the ending comes from the fact that it's incredibly fucking overhyped. Look up any other review online and you'll find the most positive thing any critic had to say about BioShock Infinite involved the ending revelation. The ending which creative director Ken Levine claims it's never been done in a game before. There are lots of different revelations throughout the story of BioShock Infinite, but the final and arguably the most important one has totally been done before. Quite recently, in fact. This gen, in fact. I can understand that the guys over at Irrational don't have time to play every single game out there while working on such a big project, but critics should fucking know better. 2009, guys. I mean, seriously, am I the only one who's played this game? The ending is also a lot more convoluted than it needed to be. The entire idea could have been explained in 3 scenes, one in an office, one in a river, and if only to explain some of the less believable sci-fi, one in a location that I won't spoil here. The explanation was bloated and overcomplicated by some admittedly technically impressive scene transitions, as well as flowery, poetic dialogue that felt jarring considering the rest of the game was very down to earth, even going so far as to avoid contemporary idioms. In terms of how the game looks, it's definitely beautiful from an artistic perspective. I keep mentioning the environments because the art really stands out. The city feels alive and vibrant, and on ultra settings, man, the game has absolutely stunning lighting. However, the game was definitely made for consoles first. There's no way around it. Textures aren't impressive, characters have a low poly count, and if you want the game to run at a smooth 60, you'll likely need to turn off light shafts and or lower shadow resolution. All in all, BioShock is enjoyable and highly recommendable, but only to a certain kind of player. If you just want to turn your brain off and feel the frantic tension of a gunfight where freedom comes in the form of superpowers, this is your game. If you don't mind enduring some tedium for the sake of first-person storytelling and appreciate well-executed character development, this is your game. However, there are other games with a broader appeal which are just as well executed as BioShock Infinite and have fewer problems. It's not game of the gen, but it's definitely a fantastic game for the right audience. My 4 out of 5 still stands.